we might just come back to that question of why there is this low take up from the buy side, and maybe if I just sort of talk through that, and then Guy, you might have some comments as well.
Yep.
I think, and certainly from, and David mentioned the 55 principles, there probably is some reticence because of the degree of sort of proportionality that may need to apply. So I think from a QIC perspective, we think that there's 40 of the 55 principles that are applicable to us, and we hold ourselves applicable to the standards of those 40. So every institution and firm probably needs to then think about the direct or indirect activity that they have in the FX market and which principles are most important. But the framework is certainly comprehensive. The 78-page document is certainly a great framework to have a constructive dialogue, both internally and then with the liquidity providers in the market. And it's pretty much, as David said, an off the shelf, ready to go framework for you to sort of think through how that applies. And obviously taking many hours of work to get it to this point. And I guess I would probably emphasise for those that think, well, it doesn't apply to us, we don't do FX, we don't trade FX, that's done by a fund manager. I think for every super fund out there, I think it's important for CIOs, CEOs to be thinking, well, how does this apply to our fund if we're signing up to this standard and this code, and ensuring that other managers and then counterparties are also part of this industry practice. And then I think beyond that, there's obviously a whole corporate industry segment, I think, where there is also applicability. So there is that proportionality element. It doesn't apply. I don't think it applies to me because my fund manager does that, or then there's probably general awareness too, as Guy said, in terms of all the other priorities on the list of super funds and corporates and so on, where this fits, and this will take some time and resources, to think through, and it does need a champion. I guess we've been fortunate at QIC to have at those subject matter experts to really believe and champion the cause in the applicability of the code, and that sort of fed up through to the executive, through to the boards, and I think our as industry leaders, I guess our role here is sort of to keep having this conversation, and in my mind, it's the G of the ESG, and it should sit up there in conversations along with climate change, modern slavery. It's the code, it's the practices operating within the largest financial market that we have globally, and it's there ready to go, and from a buy side perspective certainly does help level the playing field. So Guy, you might have some comments from your committees on other bottlenecks or obstacles to that buy side take up.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the question, as I said, is how you frame it. There are a lot of buy side participants, and in some extent, what I care the most about is actually the ones who are large and have a material imprint on the market. And particularly, if you're executing FX within house, then you're as much a market participant as anyone else. And so I would certainly encourage those participants. But as I said earlier, I look at the top asset managers in the world, we've got more than half of them now, which is what the positive way of looking at. The other less positive way of looking is we haven't got the other half. One thing I do want to pick up on is a point that David made, and has come through, and the same point's been raised in a question, is does the limited sign-up by the buy side imply disagreement with the code or some parts of it? As David mentioned, I do know that he does disagree with some parts of it, but nevertheless has still signed the code. And there are other market participants who I do talk to who say that they haven't signed the code because they don't agree with parts of it. I would say last look is probably one of the ones which gets most frequently cited. Pre-hedging is probably about on equal par with it. And I suppose it depends on which way you want to look at it. I think it's important to have a code of practice, and you may not agree with all elements, and you may want to take it further than what we've got in the code, and that's absolutely your prerogative. But absent the code, we don't have any common standard of practice across the market, and I think that's unambiguously a worse situation. And I think the proof of that pudding potentially is in the eating, which was where we were before this, and why indeed the whole work to pull the code together came about. So we do know what the other state of the world looks like, and it wasn't great. Particularly, I would say, for buy-side participants, what really wasn't that great. So I accept that everyone's not going to agree with everything we've got. In the end, we've pulled this document together, as I said, across 20 jurisdictions, across the whole breadth of market participants, and there are going to be things which everyone doesn't like. I have had to mediate any number of conversations between people on all sides of these arguments, and in the end, there is a degree of compromise. I think there is compromise, though, without watering it down to motherhood statements. And as I said, anyone has the prerogative to take in their practices certainly some of the principles we have further than what we've got. I certainly wouldn't be comfortable in someone taking them less than what we've got, but you absolutely have the prerogative to take them further. The other point, I think, is often where FX sits in the institution in buy-side firms. So there are some buy-side firms who are as large a market participant as any other, as any of the large sell-side, well, not as a large sell-side bank, but certainly any of the second-tier sell-side banks. There are buy-side firms who execute more volume regularly than some of those. If you're one of them, then I think you are a significant market participant, and absolutely I would expect you to sign the code. But there are other organisations where your engagement with the FX market is indirect, maybe through an execution agent or the person who actually manages your fund. In that world, I don't have so much problem with the fact you haven't signed the code. I think you should read it and understand how your FX business has been executed. One of the things that when Paul Fisher and I were doing the work around the 4 p.m. fix, we were, let me go with stunned. I could think a worse word if I felt so inclined. Stunned with the lack of knowledge by some very, very large institutions about the way their 4 p.m. fix orders were handled. And indeed, pretty much no knowledge. And these were some very, very large flows. And often that comes from the view that, well, I'm an equity manager or I'm a fixed income manager and I'm not an FX person. It's like, okay, fine, but you're managing a global portfolio and FX is at least as large a risk, and particularly FX execution risk, as any of those execution risks within your equity portfolio or within your fixed income portfolio. And a very good example currently is the issue around settlement risk. If you're on the other end of a settlement fail, you will notice that, regardless of how that transaction is actually executed. So, at the very least, if I was a buy-side participant, I'd like to understand what the issues are. If I'm running a Turkish lira portfolio, you've got to understand settlement fail and how that goes, and understand how that the person who's executing the trades on your behalf, how they're handling that. So I get the point that for some organisations, FX is not a big part of their business, and there I'd very much emphasise that you should read the code and understand the parts that are relevant to you, particularly around execution. That's the part I would particularly highlight. And I take the point that there are 55 principles and not all of them are relevant. I actually don't think it's all that hard to read. It's written in plain Australian. It's not written in legalese, and it's not so hard to read, particularly. And so I would encourage people to do that. I also understand that on the list of priorities that, particularly regulatory priorities that buy-side firms are having to address, this may be a fair way down the list. And again, absolutely understand that. And again, I would just encourage people to at least read it. They don't. But if you are engaging in the FX market in any substantive way, particularly as more asset managers are bringing FX execution in-house, then I think you've got to understand that you are a significant market participant, and this absolutely should be applying to you.